In December 1943, the 90th Infantry Division crossed into Normandy's frozen countryside, moving east through fields littered with the wreckage of old battles. Wallace Nathan Emmer marched with them, 27 years old, trained as a rifleman, but known among his squad for something far stranger. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest. He wasn't even a natural soldier. Before the war, he'd been an aircraft mechanic, a man who measured everything with precision. While others saw tools, he saw geometry, the quiet balance of forces hidden inside every machine. The army had given him a rifle, not a wrench. He gave it back something different. During training in England, Emmer had spent nights tinkering with broken scopes and cracked lenses scavenged from damaged rifles. One evening, while cleaning a destroyed sniper optic, he noticed a single glass tube rolling loose on the bench. A carpenter's bubble level, meant for field survey work. He attached it to the top of a rifle scope with scrap wire and tape. It looked absurd. His commanding officer laughed, called it a farmer's toy. But Emmer wasn't chasing approval. He was chasing consistency. He'd seen men miss at 400 yards because their rifles were canted, the angle of the barrel barely off level, invisible to the eye, disastrous at distance. The bubble fixed that. It made every shot true to gravity. By the time the army landed in France, Emmer's crude invention had become part of his kit, an ugly glass tube mounted beside his scope, glinting faintly in the grey light. It was the kind of idea nobody took seriously, until it started changing outcomes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for daily World War II stories. It really helps out our channel. Thanks. Now back to the story. January 1944. The Allied front near St. Lo had stagnated. German positions lined the high ridges, machine guns dug in behind hedgerows and stone walls. Visibility was poor, ranges deceptive. Every advance meant walking uphill into invisible fire. Emmer's squad, 12 men under the 358th Infantry, had been tasked with observation duty along a low ridge overlooking the German line. The cold was brutal. Rifles froze. The mud swallowed boots whole. The war had become less about glory and more about endurance. For 3 days, they watched smoke rise from the opposite slope. The enemy was close, too close, but out of sight. The ridge in front of them curved downward, creating what the maps called a defilade, a bowl of land shielded from direct fire. To hit anything beyond it was nearly impossible. Until Emmer tried something no one had before. He studied the slope, measured the angles through his scope, adjusted elevation, not by instinct, but by calculation. Using his makeshift bubble level, he aligned the rifle perfectly horizontal, then compensated by degrees rather than guesses. It was the same logic he'd used when tuning aircraft wings back home. Balance before, power. He fired once. The shot landed nearly half a mile away, a clean hit on a supply wagon barely visible in the haze. No one believed it until they saw the smoke rising. The next day, he tested it again, this time with 2 spotters. 3 German soldiers fell before anyone on the other hill even located the source. Word spread through the platoon. The mechanics level works. Over the next 2 weeks, Emmer refined the technique. He adjusted for humidity, temperature, and the curvature of the terrain. The bubble told him when the rifle was perfectly aligned to gravity, eliminating cant, drift, and human error. His range increased by hundreds of yards. The Army's standard issue M1903A4 Springfield rifle was never meant to fire effectively beyond 800 yards. With Emmer's modification, it reached over 1,200. The first time he logged the numbers in his field notebook, he didn't call it sniping. He called it engineering. By February, his squad was using his system exclusively. They set up on the ridge at dawn, firing into the valley below, not at random, but with methodical precision. German machine gun nests vanished one by one. Mortar teams never got a second shot. The unit's kill records skyrocketed. Commanders began routing intelligence through their observation post because it was the only one still intact. Within 6 weeks, Emmer's useless invention had turned 12 infantrymen into a small, untraceable artillery battery. They called it the level line. What no one realized was how deeply his method was changing the battlefield itself. Standard infantry doctrine in Europe relied on artillery and air power to eliminate fortified positions. But bad weather often grounded planes, and fog crippled visibility. The front slowed to a crawl. Emmer's group, armed only with rifles and mathematics, began doing what artillery couldn't, striking unseen targets with precision at extreme range. The army didn't understand the mechanics, but it understood the results. By April 1944, Emmer's platoon had recorded over 100 confirmed long-range kills from a single ridgeline, all shot across a defilade that most officers considered unreachable. Every bullet was logged with distance, bearing, and adjustment written in Emmer's notebook like a scientific record. His field commander sent the data to division headquarters. The reply came back one line long: "Continue experimentation." It wasn't recognition, but it was permission. And for Emmer, that was enough. The system kept evolving. Emmer began training other marksmen to use the bubble. He refined the mount, creating a crude frame from aircraft aluminum scavenged from a crashed P-47. The tube sat perfectly level above the scope now, calibrated by eye and instinct. The method spread silently through the 90th Division. Some dismissed it as superstition, others swore by it. By summer, it was no longer a trick, it was doctrine. In an army built on muscle and mass production, one quiet mechanic had introduced precision into chaos. And though he didn't know it yet, his stupid modification would travel far beyond Normandy, shaping the weapons of a new kind of warfare that was just beginning to take form. Emmer's field notebook became a different kind of manifest. Pages once filled with wrench sizes and engine notes now held angular charts, wind vectors, and lists of corrections. Elevation by degrees, cant by minutes, humidity offsets, and temperature-corrected powder tables. He treated each shot like a machining operation: set the datum, lock the axis, execute. The bubble did one job. It removed human tilt from the equation. Everything else became calculation. Division intelligence took notice when reports from adjacent units mentioned an observation post scoring impossible hits. The reports were sanitized and sent up the chain as anomalies until someone in the artillery section cross-checked maps and found a pattern: disrupted supply routes, machine gun nests eliminated, mortars that never fired twice. The common thread was a single ridge where no artillery had been placed. The ridge had only a handful of infantry with optics and patience. A small logistics team arrived under the pretense of resupply, but with the real purpose of evaluation. They brought instruments that Emmer had never seen in the field: a lens clock, a makeshift inclinometer, and a strip of metal engraved with gradations. Engineers measured the bubble's mounting, examined the improvised frame, and calculated tolerances. What looked like junk to others was precision to them. The aluminum from an aircraft skin, wire wound with the patience of a machinist, a bubble level scavenged from a carpenter's kit, and the secret that a perfectly leveled rifle removed a variable no one had bothered to quantify. The army issued orders that the experiment be formalized. Emmer's 12-man team became an experimental detachment, re-equipped with proper sniper rifles and optical mounts where available. The Springfield sniper variant remained the core weapon, but Emmer adapted barrels, bedding, and stock geometry to accept his level. Ballistic charts were printed on waterproof stock, spotters were given field barometers and a simple meteo kit, so that temperature and pressure could be logged before every engagement. The improvised rig became a system: level, calculate, record, fire. Training followed a different rhythm than the routine of infantry drills. Sessions began before dawn when the air was still and predictable. Emmer taught how cant changed point of impact by inches at 300 yards and by feet at 1,000. He demonstrated how mirage lines could fool an inexperienced eye and how a bubble level removed a subtle torque that twisted bullets off course. The men learned to convert angular corrections into clicks on their scopes and to use map contours to anticipate wind shadows. The new platoon learned to think like surveyors and shooters at once. Word moved in whispers and coded ciphers. Precision teams could be embedded where artillery could not. They could create the effect of mortar suppression without revealing gun emplacements. They could sever a supply route by targeting drivers and wheel hubs instead of convoys. Commanders realized that small teams using superior technique could impose disproportionate cost on the enemy. The concept fit the hard economics of the front. Fewer shells, fewer trucks lost to weather, fewer patrols ambushed. Where logistics were stretched thin, surgical lethality offered force multiplication. By May, the experimental detachment's impact was undeniable. Emmer's logs showed a dramatic reduction in enemy fire from specific coordinates following long-range engagements. Patrols reported safer withdrawal corridors. Small unit commanders sent urgent requests to replicate the system. Ordnance workshops in the rear began fabricating standardized mounts, and the quartermaster set up a modest supply line for bubble levels and calibrated mounting hardware. Where the modification had once been sneered at as a mechanic's toy, it now carried an internal requisition code. The technique evolved beyond a single gadget. Engineers refined telescopic reticles to include holdover lines calibrated for the new effective ranges. Spotters began using rudimentary ranging lasers and field theodolites to confirm distances when visibility allowed. The mathematics matured from approximation to protocol. Standardized environmental inputs, pre-calculated correction tables, and the first rudimentary fire control cards for snipers. Emmer himself sketched what would later be recognized as an early manual for long-range small arms engagement, a mixture of ballistics, fieldcraft, and strict record-keeping. Enemy reaction was inevitable. Once the Germans noted precise, unexpected casualties at long distance, countermeasures followed. Observation posts shifted, wire entanglements were increased, and small counter-sniper teams probed the ridge routinely. Emmer's unit adapted by decentralizing, multiple hides, staggered firing cycles, and acoustic masking. They used distraction, small patrols to draw attention, while a single shooter made the decisive shot. The level's advantage was not just mechanical, it allowed stealth to scale with geometry. Shots that had once required a tripod and minutes to set up now took seconds with a leveled mount and practiced crew. Operationally, the benefits multiplied when tied to intelligence. Recon units with aerial photos and intercepted radio logs provided targets. Supply wagons, repair crews, anti-tank teams. Emmer's detachments learned to prioritize. Disable a radio operator, kill a repairman, take out a commander. The calculus was strategic as much as it was tactical. One well-aimed shot could delay an enemy counterattack by hours, buying whole brigades time to reposition. As the system scaled, senior staff began using Emmer's data to model possibilities. Analysts plugged his range tables and hit probability curves into divisional plans. They adjusted artillery schedules to conserve shells and rerouted armored thrusts to exploit newly created gaps. The ripple effect reached forward units, where fewer frontal assaults were required and more focus could be placed on maneuver and infiltration. Emmer's detachment became an instrument of shaping the battlefield, a way to make terrain do work that numbers of men could not. By late summer, the method had left its birthplace on the ridge and appeared in other divisional reports. Sniping teams credited with holding crossroads, preventing armored repair, and halting night convoys. The Army began drafting a formal evaluation, not to brag, but to integrate. Engineers from deeper echelons proposed a field kit, a standardized bubble mount, a hardened level vial resistant to shock, and a compact inclinometer with degrees and minutes. Funding shifted from ridicule to production. Still, the inventor remained reluctant to claim ownership. Emmer continued to measure before firing, to note temperature and pressure, to log each shot with a machinist's care. In his notebooks, the bubble line was annotated not with glory, but with improvement. Realign mount to decrease lateral play. Shorter screw reduces parallax. He was a mechanic by temperament and a soldier by necessity, the combination that would eventually turn a dismissed tool into doctrine. The Army's first formal manual on long-range marksmanship would later name the basic principle, true level, as foundational. It would not, in its initial drafts, attribute the origin to any single man. Bureaucracy preferred anonymity. but the front line recognized the source within months. Where the bubble level appeared, the field became precise, and where precision ruled, fewer men died for the same ground. In the weeks that followed, with winter closing and operations intensifying across the front, Emmer's teams compiled a list of engagements where long-range precision had saved entire platoons from exposure. The most dramatic entry would come after months of incremental victories. A single coordinated action across a defilade that would be logged in battalion reports as the Ridge engagement. It would mark the moment when theory became legend. By September 1944, the war in France had shifted eastward. What had begun as a slow grind through hedgerows was now a race toward the German border. The 90th Infantry Division was pushing through Lorraine, the air thick with mist and the sound of distant artillery. The ridge near the town of Étain had become a choke point, a low, rolling slope dividing two river valleys, the kind of terrain where battles lingered longer than they should. On paper, it was insignificant. In reality, it controlled the supply artery that fed an entire German regiment defending the Siegfried Line. The ridge was too high to storm and too low for artillery to target effectively. Shells overshot, mortars scattered. Air support couldn't see through the haze. Every attempt to advance ended in the same way, men crawling forward, pinned by machine guns they couldn't see. That was when Emmer's experimental detachment was called in. They arrived at dawn, moving silently through the fog, carrying field scopes, tripods, and rifles fitted with their leveled mounts. The ridge itself was deceptive. A gentle slope that looked harmless until you crested it and found nothing but open killing ground on the other side. Emmer studied it like a machinist studying a blueprint. The earth was geometry. The hill was an equation. He spent hours mapping its curvature, measuring the drop angles, and marking invisible lines on the dirt where the bubble's true level matched gravity. Behind him, his spotters arranged their rifles in sequence, 12 men forming what looked less like a squad and more like a survey crew. The instruments aligned, calibrated, and checked again. They were setting up for something no infantry unit had ever attempted: synchronized long-range fire across a terrain barrier, relying purely on math. By mid-morning, the fog had begun to lift, revealing shapes moving far below. The German column was unaware that the hill above them was alive with glass and steel. Trucks, munitions, and men clustered near the road's edge. Easy targets, if only the angle could be solved. For years, snipers had learned that firing over a hill was unreliable. Gravity and drag twisted trajectories beyond calculation. But Emmer's system accounted for it. The bubble level aligned every rifle perfectly to horizontal. With that axis true, his calculations for arc and fall were exact. At Étain 40, he gave the signal to begin, not with words, but with movement. The first volley cracked across the ridge. Dozens of rounds sliced through the air, unseen, unheard, until they struck. The convoy erupted into chaos. German soldiers scrambled for cover, unaware that the fire was coming from beyond the crest, from rifles invisible to their scopes. The second volley followed 30 seconds later, then another. Each man on the ridge fired by number, like gears turning in a machine. Targets were pre-assigned, range adjustments made to the 10th of a degree. Within 10 minutes, the valley below became a trap. Trucks burned, ammunition detonated. A line of communication that had fed an entire regiment was cut to pieces by 12 men who never crossed the hill. Observers counted 98 confirmed kills in the first engagement, with additional casualties from secondary explosions. The operation was logged in division records as Overwatch Action, Étain Ridge. But among the men who fought it, the name was simpler. They called it the hill that shot back. When reports reached headquarters, disbelief followed. No artillery, no airstrikes, just a squad with rifles and geometry. Commanders demanded confirmation. Aerial reconnaissance took photographs of the aftermath. The damage pattern was unmistakable. Clean directional hits from high-angle trajectories consistent with small arms fire. The data went to the Army's Ballistics Research Laboratory, where technicians plotted trajectories and calculated angles. The math shouldn't have worked, and yet it did. The only variable unaccounted for in traditional shooting tables was rifle cant. Emmer's level had eliminated it. The Étain engagement was forwarded to the Ordnance Department as a proof of concept. A directive soon followed. Field leveling devices recommended for experimental sniper kits, European theatre. It was the first official recognition of the system, though Emmer's name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. That was fine by him. He was back on the ridge 2 days later, cleaning brass and recalibrating optics. His notebook grew heavier with data, temperature shifts, pressure readings, shot groupings. To him, every engagement was another test. The army called it luck. He called it tolerance. Winter came early that year. The Battle of the Bulge began in December, catching everyone unprepared. Fog, snow, and radio silence turned Europe into a white labyrinth. Once again, visibility vanished. And once again, Emmer's invention proved its worth. In the frozen Ardennes, when spotters couldn't see and artillery couldn't adjust, snipers relied on the bubble, a strip of air trapped in glass that never lied. From dugouts buried in snow, Emmer's men could align their rifles blind, confident that even without sight, gravity would remain constant. They didn't just hold positions, they defined them. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was encircled, Emmer's range data was used to calibrate defensive fire for nearby infantry units. His equations became the bridge between small arms and artillery, the fine-tuned mathematics of survival. By the time the Ardennes campaign ended, the 90th Infantry Division had become one of the most effective precision units in Europe. Commanders credited logistics, weather, and training. The men in the field knew better. They credited the level. In February 1945, Emmer's detachment was formally absorbed into the Army's 1st Tactical Analysis Group, a small circle of engineers and ballistics experts tasked with documenting frontline innovations. They asked him to explain the concept for the record. He handed over his field notebook, its pages worn thin from rain and grease. Inside were 14,000 words of hand-drawn charts, firing solutions, and annotations, a mechanical blueprint for precision shooting. At the end, he'd written one sentence. "The rifle is only as straight as the hand that holds it, so make the hand true." That line became the unofficial motto of every sniper school established after the war. When the conflict finally ended, Emmer was discharged quietly with no commendation beyond his standard service medals. But within the Army's ordnance archives, his data lived on. His range charts became part of a 1946 research paper titled Cant Error and Long-Range Fire Accuracy, authored by anonymous contributors from field observations. Historians would later trace the handwriting on those charts. It matched the signature of Wallace Nathan Emmer. In time, the ridge at Étain was forgotten, buried under grass, marked by no monument. But for those who knew, it was the birthplace of modern marksmanship, where one man's rejected idea turned a squad of infantry into an instrument of precision, and where geometry itself became a weapon. The Army had called his invention useless. The Germans learned otherwise, and the invisible line of that bubble, that perfect horizon inside a glass tube, would go on to define the shape of war for generations to come. When the guns finally fell silent, the work of war did not vanish. It moved into quieter rooms where engineers, technicians, and historians argued over marginal gains. Emmer returned home, a private man, with a notebook full of numbers and a habit of measuring things other people took for granted. The Army discharged him, and the world expected him to vanish into civilian life. Instead, his little strip of experiments began to travel through the bureaucracy in the form of reports, footnotes, and raw field data. The Ordnance Department's post-war review teams were not looking for magic. They were looking for repeatable advantage. Emmer's charts arrived in Washington, nested inside a larger file of field innovations. At first glance, they looked like the scribbles of a mechanic who'd been at the front too long. But technicians saw what the field commanders had seen in combat: consistency. Where his notebooks were complete, with temperature, wind, humidity, cant angle, and impact points, there was a reliability that could be taught. Ballistics laboratories began to test the variables empirically. In climate-controlled ranges, they mounted rifles with and without level devices and recorded drift across hundreds of shots. The results were clear, eliminating cant-reduced shot dispersion at long range by measurable margins. The practical effect translated into doctrine. Military marksmanship schools converted field lessons into training modules. What had been a homemade glass tube became a standard item on sniper alignment checklists. Optics manufacturers took note. Companies that had supplied lenses to the army during the war began redesigning scope mounts to accommodate leveling solutions. Reticles were rethought, holdover marks indexed to more precise environmental tables, parallax adjustments manufactured to tighter tolerances, and turret clicks standardized in increments that matched Emmer's correction charts. European and American firms alike stamped their instruction manuals with new tables that resembled the pages of Emmer's notebook. By the early 1950s, military institutes formally integrated the principle into sniper curricula. The emphasis moved from individual talent alone to systemized reproducibility. Training programs taught soldiers to measure before they shot, to record environmental conditions, and to treat their rifles as instruments requiring calibration rather than extensions of muscle memory. Sniper teams became two-person engineering units, one to level and calculate, the other to spot and confirm. The amateur jerry-rigging of a carpenter's level gave way to hardened vials and machined mounts built to endure recoil and weather. Civilian marksmen and competitive shooters followed. Long-range sport shooting organizations published articles referencing the marginal gains once scoffed at in field huts. Commercial scope manufacturers created aftermarket leveling rings and bubble attachments marketed to hunters and competition shooters, touting increased repeatability and smaller group sizes at long distances. What had once been a battlefield curiosity entered the catalogues of precision sports, and hobbyists unknowingly adopted a technique refined under fire. Academic researchers took interest too. Universities with engineering and ballistics programs requested access to the wartime data. Papers appeared analyzing the error budgets of small arms fire, quantifying the role of cant error among other factors. The studies confirmed what frontline combatants had known in their bones. At extended ranges, fractions of a degree mattered. Emmer's notebooks, once dismissed, became primary source material in peer-reviewed papers. They were cited not as folklore, but as field-validated data points in the study of terminal ballistics. The ripple extended to Allied militaries. NATO field manuals eventually codified procedures that mirrored Emmer's methods, standardized leveling before engagement, environmental logging, and integrated sniper fire planning. When new weapon systems were developed, ergonomics included features that reduced unintended cant, bedding designs in stocks, rotationally locked mounts, and anti-twist interface plates became part of the procurement checklist. In that slow, bureaucratic way, a battlefield tweak migrated into procurement policy, design specification, and supply chain lists. Emmer himself watched with an engineer's satisfaction. He never sought fame. He lived modestly, kept his notebooks, and accepted letters from men who signed only with initials and unit numbers, veterans thanking him for something they had once called luck. He occasionally submitted technical clarifications to military journals and gave anonymous testimony to committees planning marksmanship doctrine. His signature appeared on the margins of studies that shaped the Army's training doctrine for decades. Public recognition lagged. Where the D-Day and Battle of the Bulge memorials gathered crowds and medals, the quiet march of scientific adoption collected footnotes and spec sheets. Yet a different kind of monument formed, the doctrine itself. For soldiers deployed in later conflicts, the practices inspired by Emmer's work were institutional and routine. Where once a bubble level on a rifle provoked laughter, decades later, the first item on a sniper team's checklist was a calibration check under the heading, Ensure True Level. Manufacturers went on to refine and replace mechanical vials with gyroscopic sensors and inertial measurement units in the late 20th century. Electronic fire control systems in advanced small arms platforms integrated sensors to automatically compensate for cant and yaw, lowering the cognitive load on shooters. Modern military forces field equipment that completes Emmer's original intent in microseconds. The rifle is measured, the axis is true, the system corrects, and the shot proceeds. The science had matured, but the starting point remained the same: a desire to remove an avoidable human error. Museums occasionally rediscovered the artifact itself, an old Springfield fitted with a bubble ring, donated by a veteran and placed behind glass in an exhibit on soldier innovation. Curators wrote placards explaining the device's role. Enthusiasts argued over provenance. Historians cross-referenced field reports with Emmer's handwriting. When scholars finally traced the earliest references, they documented the man behind the diagrams, the mechanic who treated geometry like a weapon. The family preserved his notebooks. They ended up in university archives where graduate students pored over the penciled tables and, with modern tools, replicated his experiments. The data held. The tests confirmed that his contributions were not quixotic, but foundational. They added footnotes to journals and citations to textbooks. The name that had once been anonymous in ordnance files surfaced in a few scholarly papers. And yet the public memory remained selective. Greatest hits of the war kept their place in plaques, films, and liturgies. The invisible work, the quiet calculus that made those hits possible, lingered in the background, affecting outcomes without asking for attention. Emmer's legacy was practical, less in headlines than in reduced casualties, in fewer wasted missions, in logistics that balanced on the difference between a steady hand and a tilted one. By the time the Cold War dissolved into something less kinetic and more strategic, the principle had been absorbed into military culture. New soldiers learned to carry measurement tools as reflexively as they carried extra ammunition. They learned that modern combat relied as much on systems and discipline as on bravery. And when they calibrated their instruments before a mission, they were performing a ritual whose origin lay not in doctrine rooms in Washington, but in mud, on a windy ridge, where a man fixed a strip of glass to a rifle and decided to make the hand true. History tends to remember the thunder, not the geometry. It celebrates the charge, not the calibration. But sometimes what wins a war isn't louder firepower or stronger armor. It's precision, the ability to make one bullet count for 100. Wallace Nathan Emmer never thought of himself as an inventor. He thought like a mechanic, someone who fixed problems instead of talking about them. The rifle to him was just another machine, a series of tolerances waiting to be aligned. When the army laughed at his bubble level, he didn't argue. He simply made it work, and it worked better than anyone could have imagined. The system he created, a few inches of glass and the logic of balance, reshaped marksmanship forever. Every sniper rifle built since the 1950s carries his fingerprints, from the analog vials mounted beside Cold War rifles to the digital cant sensors buried inside modern scopes. The physics is the same, unchanged since the day he tested it on a wind-blown ridge in France. What he built wasn't just a device, it was a doctrine, the belief that precision could outlast chaos. Today, soldiers train on ranges he would barely recognize. Computers track every variable. Ballistic calculators factor temperature, humidity, and spin drift in seconds. But when they sight in, when they level their scope and steady their breathing, they still obey the same rule Emmer wrote in pencil in the margins of his notebook 80 years ago. Make the hand true. He never received a medal for it. No headline carried his name. His invention was too small, too practical, too quiet. But his precision saved lives, shaped doctrines, and carried forward through every rifle fired in the decades that followed. The bubble level, once mocked as a useless piece of carpenter's junk, became a symbol of invisible mastery, a reminder that sometimes the line between success and disaster is measured not in courage, but in degrees. The world moved on, the wars changed, the weapons evolved. But every time a marksman takes aim, steadies the crosshairs, and levels his rifle against the horizon, they're retracing a motion born in 1944, on a frozen hill, beneath low cloud, when one quiet soldier looked at the impossible distance ahead and refused to accept that it couldn't be reached. His squad killed 100 men that day, but his invention saved countless more in the years that followed. That was the paradox of Emmer's war. Destruction that built precision, precision that preserved life. And though time has washed away his name from most histories, the legacy endures wherever patience meets purpose. Every shot that flies straight, every weapon built to hit what it aims for, every soldier who trusts the line of a level before pulling the trigger, they all carry a fraction of his thought. The army once called his idea useless. History proved otherwise. Because Wallace Nathan Emmer didn't invent a weapon. He invented accuracy. And in war, as in everything, accuracy is the closest thing there is to truth.